Welcome back to the Rundown. Let's turn east now to the island nation of Taiwan and its capital, Taipei, which is a city with hundreds of temples, Buddhist, Taoist, Confucianist. But in the middle of this sprawling Asian city is something that's a little less expected in that part of the world, the Taipei Grand Mosque. Our senior international affairs correspondent Owen Alterman recently visited Taiwan as a guest of the Taiwanese government. And while on that island nation, he visited the Taipei Mosque to learn about the Muslim community and its fascinating history there. Let's take a look.
The call to Friday prayers in Taipei, Taiwan. Here, 5,108 miles from Mecca, is a city with hundreds of Chinese temples. And this place, the Taipei Grand Mosque. Here, every Friday, some of Taiwan's 60,000 Muslims come to pray, to meet, and to eat, taking off shoes before kneeling down in prayer. Later, grabbing a bite at the weekly food market, where community members set up stalls with food from around Asia and the Middle East. Many here are Taiwanese citizens and were born on the island. Their family's story, part of the fabric of Taiwan's story.
It's just like the Communist Party against the fighting, they failed, coming over here, like Chiang Kai-shek.
In 1949, the Communist Party took control of China. The deposed government, headed by Chiang Kai-shek, fled here to Taiwan. Modern Taiwan grew out of the state they built. In that army were thousands of soldiers, a high percentage of them Muslim. The soldiers' descendants are still here.
Mostly they don't believe the communists. Yeah, the communists said no God, no God. Even right now, that's the reason why they don't have a diplomatic relation with the Rome Vatican. You know, they said no, I don't believe. If you're a party member of the communists, no religion change, they said, that otherwise you will be penalty.
In the years since 1949, Muslims here have built a small but vibrant community. In 1960, they built the Grand Mosque with funding from Saudi Arabia. Later, the veterans of the Chinese Civil War were joined by migrants who have come to Taiwan from outside to live, work, and study, hailing from places like Indonesia.
I was studying here, studying my master, and then I'm continuing my PhD.
On politics, people here struck a moderate tone, praising outreach from the Taiwanese government and welcoming the visiting Israeli reporter.
I know it's Israel. I read some newspaper news about Israel. It's a great country, I think. The water is very important, so it's from the sea, ocean, and converted, salted into pure water.
Friday prayers have just let out here at the Taipei Grand Mosque, and the community is heading home. But they'll be back next week and the week after in this fascinating outpost of the Muslim world. Owen Alterman, I-24 News, Taipei, Taiwan.
And our international affairs correspondent, Bianca Zanini, is with us in studio now. Bianca, thank you for joining us. Let's maybe try to put the Muslim community of Taiwan in context within the framework of the country and the capital city, where Owen is now visiting.
Right, so today Taiwan is really in many ways an open, liberal democracy. It has some of the freest media in the West. It has a booming tech industry. It's doing really well financially. But not only is it very, very dependent on China, China sees it as part of China, of course. So recently they elected their first female president, Tsai Ing-wen. And she wants independence. But of course, as we've seen recently in other regions of the world, that's not easy to achieve, especially not with this historical context. Let's go back in history a little bit. Taiwan has historically been thrown back and forth between China and Japan. In the 1600s, the island came under the administration of China's Qing dynasty, and then in 1895, Japan defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War. They took control of Taiwan, and then 50 years later, China took back control of Taiwan after the Japanese were defeated in the Second World War. Now, in the meantime, the communists and the nationalists were fighting a civil war inside China, and this is what we heard briefly in Owen's video. The nationalists lost to the communist forces, and the Nationalist Party leader, Chiang Kai-shek, fled to Taiwan, and he ruled Taiwan with an iron fist until 1975. And as Owen mentioned, most of the Taiwanese Muslims today are descendants, the grandkids and kids of the soldiers who fought for and under the nationalist leader. In 1987, Taiwan ended almost 4 decades of martial law dictatorship, and in 1992 we saw the first full parliamentary elections. And since then, it's really, in just 3 decades, it's really gone from a martial law to an open, flourishing democracy. It embraces human rights, unlike China, mainland China, and that also goes for the Muslim community.
Well, let me ask you about that, because you mentioned the communist rule in mainland China, and we know that that rule, that regime, definitely persecuted religious practice. And even now, when the communist ideology has been replaced more by capitalist, Beijing is still said to be in conflict with some of the Muslim population that's more in the west of the country there. How has it been for the Muslims in Taiwan?
Well, let's take a look at how many Muslims there are. It makes out a little less of 0.3 of the Taiwanese population. That's around 60,000 Taiwanese Muslims, and their rights are really protected in many ways. There's even this famous story of a factory owner who was sentenced to 6 months in jail for forcing Muslim workers to eat pork. So their rights are protected, and this goes really well with what Owen said and what we heard in the video, that it was a very wonderful community. He said it both in the piece, but also to me, he said it was a very warm community, and the locals there are actually a minority within the Muslim community there. There's an additional 200 to 250,000 foreign Muslim workers, mainly from Indonesia, Pakistan, Myanmar, India, and this is part of the bigger effort of the Taiwanese government to open up towards other countries, towards Southeast of Asia.
So the Muslim community that's there, the established one, they are ethnically Chinese then, from, again, some of what we know from those that are more in the western part of the country, which edges on more the Central Asian Muslim community there.
Yeah, so they came from China, and now there are an additional majority that are workers and students, and this really plays well into Taiwan's outreach towards Southeast Asia. It's a part of a bigger strategy. Right now, China makes out over 20% of Taiwan's total trade. U.S. comes as a far second, so the president right now really is trying to open up to trade in other countries and also cultural diversity, which is why we have so many Muslims there.
Bianca Zanini, our international affairs correspondent, who's not in Taiwan, but still happy to be here with us in studio.
Maybe you'll go next year.
Thank you very much,
Or
Bianca.
me.
You're staying here on The Rundown with me, and still to come.